Let me tell you about a cold blue morning in the middle of November 1986 at a ranch foreclosure auction in Chavez County, New Mexico, about 11 miles southeast of Roswell. If you've never seen one, picture this. You're standing on hard caliche dust the color of old bone, the high desert stretching flat in every direction, mesquite and bunch grass, and the bare red gravel of the Pecos slope rising to the east. There's a big cream-colored canvas tent pitched right there on the property, the kind they haul out on a flatbed and stake down with iron pegs the size of railroad spikes. Inside the tent, rows of wooden folding chairs, a raised plywood platform at the front, an auctioneer's podium with a microphone wired to two tinny speakers up on poles. The air smells like coal dust and diesel exhaust from the trucks parked outside, and the burnt coffee in a 50-cup percolator on a folding table by the door. It's the kind of morning where your breath comes out white, and your hands stay in your coat pockets until the bidding starts. Because once it starts, you'd better have a paddle ready. Now, into that tent, just before 8 in the morning on a Friday, walked a 14-year-old boy named Calvin Doerr. Everybody who knew him called him Cal. He'd driven himself the 17 miles down from his aunt's house in Roswell in a 1974 Ford F-150 that had belonged to his grandfather, a faded blue work truck with a dented tailgate and a cracked windshield repaired with a strip of clear tape. He had a learner's permit, 6 months old, and no adult riding with him to vouch for the fact that he had any business being there alone. In the inside pocket of his coat, folded into a brown leather wallet that had also belonged to his grandfather, he carried $1,840 in cash. Some of it was in 20s, some of it was in 5s. All of it was money he had saved over 3 years of working calving season on neighboring ranches, cleaning out collapsed water wells, repairing windmills with old men who couldn't climb the towers anymore. And tucked under his left arm, in a worn manila folder bound shut with a rubber band, he carried a set of soil survey maps, a hydrology report bound in pale green cardstock, and a leather-covered field notebook so worn at the edges that the cowhide had gone the color of dark honey. Now here's what you need to understand about that auction tent that morning. There were 47 registered bidders inside it. Most of them were ranchers and cattle buyers from Chavez and Eddy and Lee counties, men who had been working this stretch of New Mexico high desert since before Eisenhower built the interstate. Weathered men, sun-lined faces, resistal cowboy hats with the brims shaped from 20 years of being pulled off and set on porch rails. They knew each other by the trucks they drove, and the brands burned on their cattle, and the way their fathers had run the same dry land before them. And scattered along the back 2 rows of folding chairs, you had a different kind of buyer. Investor types out of Dallas and Lubbock and Midland, men in their 40s in pressed dark blue Wranglers, and crisp pearl snap Western shirts that had never seen a day of real work. New Lucchese boots without a scuff on them. Brand new felt Stetsons sitting on their heads like they'd been put there by a hat shop clerk 5 minutes ago. One of them had a brick-sized Motorola cellular telephone resting on the chair beside him. Another held a brown leather portfolio with the name of a land speculation company stamped on it in gold. They were there because 1986 was the bottom of the worst farm crisis since the Dust Bowl, and ranch foreclosures across the Southwest were selling for 30 cents on the dollar. They were there to buy cheap and resell to oil companies inside 18 months. Now, the man calling the auction that morning was Walt Pemberton. Walt was 64 years old that November. He'd been working livestock and land auctions out of Artesian, New Mexico for 38 years, and there wasn't a rancher in the southeast quarter of the state who didn't know his voice. He was standing near the registration table in a gray resistal hat and a black string tie when Cal Doerr came through the tent flap, and he watched the boy walk down the center aisle alone. And he turned to the registration clerk next to him and he said, and I'm quoting Walt here because he told me this himself many years later. He said, quiet, with no meanness in it. Somebody's grandson came to play rancher this morning. He said it the way you'd say it about a child trying on his daddy's hat in front of a mirror. Amused, a little charmed, but certain. Because in Walt's world in that tent, on that Friday morning, there was no other explanation for what he was seeing. 14-year-old boys did not come to bankruptcy auctions alone, with leather wallets full of cash in cold borrowed trucks. That simply was not a thing that happened in the high desert of New Mexico in the autumn of 1986. And most of the men in that tent, when they bothered to notice the boy at all, were thinking exactly the same thing. But here's the thing. Cal Doerr was not playing rancher. He was working. He took the folder from under his arm. He unfolded a Soil Conservation Service survey map of the Crosby Ranch parcels onto an empty chair. He pulled out the field notebook. He walked outside through a flap at the side of the tent into the cold New Mexico sun, and he started walking the parcels. The Crosby Ranch had been broken into 11 parcels for the auction, each one staked out with red ribbon and a numbered wooden post. Cal walked them one by one. He stopped at each one, opened his notebook, checked his map, looked at the lay of the land. He didn't look at the pretty parcels. He didn't look at the ones with standing grass or working windmills or the small fence section with the ranch house on it. He looked at the ones the men inside the tent had already written off, and he stopped, finally, at parcel number 7, and he stayed there for 38 minutes. But that's not what this story is really about. Not yet. Soil Conservation Service surveys were public documents compiled by the United States Department of Agriculture starting in the 1930s to map soil composition, water tables, and erosion across American agricultural land. By the 1980s, hundreds of thousands of these surveys existed in regional archives, and most ranchers had never read the one covering their own property. The information was free, available to any citizen who asked. The men inside that tent had access to every document Cal Doerr was carrying. They had just never thought to look. Now to understand how a 14-year-old boy ended up alone at a bankruptcy auction in Roswell, New Mexico, on the morning of November 14th, 1986. With $1,800 in cash and a survey map under his arm, you need to know where he came from. And to know where he came from, you need to know about his grandfather. So let me tell you about Halvor Doerr. Halvor Doerr was born on a wheat farm outside Williston, North Dakota, in the spring of 1921. He grew up in the Dust Bowl, watched his father's topsoil blow east into Minnesota over the course of 4 bad years, and decided when he was 16 years old that he was going to spend the rest of his life understanding why dirt does what it does. He went to college on the GI Bill after the war, graduated in 1948 with a degree in soil science from North Dakota State. And a month after graduation, he loaded everything he owned into a '46 Chevy and drove south to take a job with the United States Soil Conservation Service in the regional office at Artesian, New Mexico. He came to a country he did not know. High desert, hard alkaline soil, aquifers he had never studied in school. And he came to a country that did not particularly want him. The ranchers in Chavez and Eddy County had been running cattle on that land for 3 generations, and they did not believe a 27-year-old government man from North Dakota had anything to teach them about it. He'd pull up at a ranch gate in a green government pickup, and the rancher would lean on the fence and listen for about 12 seconds. And then he'd say, "Government man doesn't know dirt." And Halvor would drive home in the dust and sit at his kitchen table at night and start over again the next morning. And here's what he did with that. He didn't quit. He didn't go back to North Dakota. What he did was he started keeping his own records. Every property he surveyed for the Soil Conservation Service, he kept a copy of the report. Every United States Geological Survey open file report that came across his desk, he made a duplicate and filed it. Every well log, every aquifer map, every groundwater observation journal published by the state of New Mexico between 1948 and his retirement in 1979, he kept. By the time he retired, he had a leather-bound cedar trunk in the back room of his small ranch house north of Roswell that contained 4 decades of hydrology and soil science, covering every section of land within 100 miles of his front door. And nobody else in 3 counties had anything like it. Now Cal Doerr was born in March of 1972, and starting when Cal was about 7 years old, which would have been 1979, his grandfather started taking him along on what he called his Saturday drives. They weren't really drives. They were walks across other people's land with maps. Halvor would pick up his grandson at 6 in the morning, and they'd drive an hour out into the desert, and they'd park at a fence line, and they'd walk. Halvor didn't lecture the boy. That wasn't his way. What he did was he handed him things. "Hold this measuring rod, son. Read me that number off the brass meter. Watch the way the soil changes color right where the grade dips." And Cal would walk beside his grandfather, 7 years old, then 8, then 9, learning to read the land the way other boys his age were learning to read baseball cards. By the time Cal was 10, he could look at a stretch of bunch grass and tell you whether the water table beneath it had dropped in the last 20 years. By 11, he could use the small brass hydrology instrument his grandfather carried in a worn felt case. A beautiful precision tool that measured electrical conductivity in shallow groundwater. the kind of instrument they don't make anymore. By 12, he could take a USGS open file report, cross-reference it against a Soil Conservation Service survey, and find anomalies that even his grandfather, after 40 years, had to lean over the kitchen table and squint at. And this is the part that matters. Calvin Doerr died of a heart attack in February of 1985. Cal was 12 years old. It happened in the shop behind the small ranch house. Halvor was 63. The funeral was small, and when the small estate was settled, Halvor had left Cal 3 things. He'd left him the cedar trunk full of documents. He'd left him the leather-filled notebook he had carried every working day for 31 years. And he'd left him the brass hydrology instrument in its felt case. There was a folded note tucked under the lid of the trunk. 2 words in careful handwriting. The note said, "Read them." That was it. No instructions, no explanations, just read them. And that's exactly what Cal did. For the next 18 months in the bedroom of his aunt's small bungalow on the north side of Roswell, where the family had moved after his father lost the farm in the spring of 1985 during the agricultural credit collapse, Cal read those documents. He read them at night by the light of a gooseneck desk lamp. He read them on Sunday afternoons. He read them while his classmates were watching television and shooting hoops in driveways. He didn't try to learn everything. He picked a region. He picked the land within 30 miles of Roswell, the land he knew, the land he'd walked with his grandfather. And he read every report, every survey, every well log that covered that ground. He built a mental map of the water beneath the desert that nobody else carried around in their head. And somewhere in the fall of 1986, probably in October, Cal opened a thin pamphlet bound in pale green cardstock. The cover said, United States Geological Survey, Open File Report. 78-441, October 1978. It was 48 pages long. It described in plain technical language a series of small confined Artesian lenses discovered during a regional groundwater study of southern Chavez County. The lenses sat below a layer of impermeable clay that separated them from the main Ogallala aquifer above. They were small, they were isolated, and they were under significant natural pressure. The report listed 7 confirmed lenses by precise location, township, range, section, and one of those locations listed on page 46 sat directly under a parcel of land that had belonged to a rancher named Crosby for 41 years. The same Crosby whose ranch was now scheduled to be sold off in 11 parcels at a bankruptcy auction outside Roswell. On the morning of November 14th, 1986. Cal read that page 3 times. Then he opened the soil survey for that section, traced the parcel boundary in pencil, measured the elevation gradient, and confirmed it. The natural Artesian lens described in the 78 report sat at a depth of 287 feet beneath what was now parcel number 7. And the existing well on the Crosby Ranch, dug in 1963, had been drilled to 110 feet. They had never even come close. United States Geological Survey open file reports are preliminary technical documents released to the public before final publication. They contain detailed scientific data on water resources, mineral deposits, and geological features across the country. Most are available free of charge at federal repository libraries. The information in them is not secret. It has simply never been read by the people standing on the land it describes. A small confined Artesian aquifer, when tapped, can produce water under its own pressure, without pumping, for decades. Now let's go back to that auction tent. It's 9:45 in the morning. The November sun has climbed high enough to throw thin yellow light through the open tent flap, and you can see the dust motes drifting in the shafts of it. The canvas walls have gone from cold gray to warm cream as the sun warms them. 47 registered bidders are seated in the wooden folding chairs. The investor men from Dallas are leaned back with their arms folded. The local ranchers are leaned forward, paddles ready, and Cal Doerr is standing in the back aisle, near the tent flap, his coat still buttoned, his paddle with the number 31 printed on it held loose at his side. Walt Pemberton climbed up onto the plywood platform at 9:46. He tapped the microphone twice. He cleared his throat, and he started the auction. Now, if you've never heard a livestock and land auctioneer work, I'll tell you it's a kind of music. It's a chant. Numbers sung out fast and steady, with the crowd answering back with paddles and nods and small quiet signals that only the auctioneer and the spotters can read. And on that Friday morning, with 47 bidders and 11 parcels to move before noon, Walt Pemberton meant to keep things moving. Parcel 1 went first, the ranch house and the home section, 60 acres with the buildings. Walt opened it at $1,200 an acre, and it sold to a rancher out of Carlsbad for $900. Parcel 2, the south pasture with the working windmill, went for $640 an acre. Parcel 3, Parcel 4, Parcel 5. The rhythm built up. The investors from Dallas took 2 of the larger parcels at the back of the property, paying a little more than the locals wanted to pay. The locals took the parcels with water on them, the ones with the active wells, the ones a rancher could actually use. Cal didn't raise his paddle. Not at Parcel 1, not at Parcel 3, not at Parcel 6. He stood in the back of the tent, and he watched. He had not come for any of those parcels. At 10:31, Walt called parcel number 7. The spotters didn't have anything to walk into the tent because Parcel 7 was a piece of land outside the tent flap, plain to see from where everybody sat. 320 acres of what looked like dead-high desert. A dry pond at the center, the mud cracked into hexagons the size of dinner plates. A non-functioning windmill leaning at an angle. A collapsed wooden well house. No standing grass to speak of. Walt looked down at his clipboard, and he read the description in a flat, plain voice. Parcel 7. 320 acres. No active water rights. Existing well non-functional. Sold as is. No warranty. Then he started the bidding. Who'll give me 40 an acre? 40 an acre to start? 40? Silence. Not a paddle moved. The investor in the brand new Stetson with the leather portfolio actually laughed out loud, quiet, into the ear of the man beside him. All right, Walt said. Give me 25. 25 an acre. Somebody start me at 25. Nothing. 15. 15 an acre. Somebody give me 15 on this. And from the left side of the tent, a hand went up. It was a salvage land buyer out of Hobbs, a man whose name I'll leave out because he is still living. He bought distressed parcels for the surface rights, fenced them off, and sold them in 5-acre pieces to people who wanted to put a trailer in the desert. $15 an acre on 320 acres came to $4,800. He bid 15. And then Cal Doerr raised his paddle. He raised it slow, not timid, slow, deliberate. The way you raise a paddle when you want to make absolutely sure there is no mistaking what you mean to do. Number 31, 18. The salvage buyer turned in his chair and looked at the boy in the back of the tent. He looked back at Walt. The investor from Dallas with the cellular telephone leaned over to his friend and said something behind his hand. And they both smirked. Walt Pemberton, on the platform, paused for half a second. Then he picked up his chant. I have 18. 18 from number 31. Do I hear 20? 20 an acre? 20? The salvage buyer raised his paddle. 20. Cal. 23. Salvage buyer hesitated. 23 an acre on 320 acres was $7,360. He had walked into that tent with a ceiling of about $6,500. He looked at the boy. He looked at the parcel out beyond the tent flap, the dry pond, the leaning windmill, the cracked mud. He shook his head. Walt waited 3 full seconds. Going once, going twice. Gavel came down. Sold. Parcel 7, 320 acres. $23 an acre. $7,360. Bidder number 31. And just like that, Calvin Doerr, 14 years old, alone, on a 6-month-old learner's permit, in the back of a canvas tent, in the high desert of New Mexico, in the cold blue light of November, owned 320 acres of what every man in that tent believed was dust. He had $480 left in the leather wallet. Now here's where the story turns. Cal walked over to the side table to sign the deed transfer paperwork. He counted out the money in 20s. The clerk counted it back. Cal signed his name in a small, careful hand. And as he came back out into the main tent, Walt Pemberton was waiting for him in the aisle, not blocking his path, but standing in a way that made it clear he had something to say. He said it gently. I want you to hear that. He was not being cruel. Son, he said, I don't mean to step in where I'm not wanted, but I've been in this business a long time, and I'd hate to see you lose your money. There's no water under that parcel. Crosby pulled that windmill in '71 because the well went dry. What you've bought yourself, I'm sorry to say, is 320 acres of dust. And Cal Doerr looked up at him. He was maybe 5'5". Walt was 6'1". He said, perfectly calm, "Sir, it's not dust. There's a confined Artesian lens at 287 feet. The Crosby well only went to 110. They never got close to it." Walt Pemberton blinked. He said, "Now hold on, how do you know that?" And Cal said, "USGS Open File Report 78-441, page 46. Lists 7 confirmed Artesian lenses in southern Chaves County by section. This parcel is one of them. The report's 8 years old." Walt stared at him. He said, "And what's it going to cost you to drill it?" And Cal said, "Bell Brothers out of Artesia will rotary drill to 300 feet for about $3,200. If the report's right, I won't even need a pump. Artesian pressure should push the water up on its own." Now, I want you to picture this. The auction had moved on to Parcel 8, and Walt had a spotter handling the bidding for him, but the men in the back rows had heard the exchange. 12 or 15 ranchers had drifted over to see what Walt was saying to the boy, and they had just heard his answer. And they were right at that second, recalibrating every assumption they had made about him since 8 that morning. Walt said, "Where in the world did you learn that, son?" And Cal said, "My grandfather, Halvor Doerr, out of north of Roswell. He worked for the Soil Conservation Service." And Walt Pemberton, who had been calling auctions in southeast New Mexico for 38 years, tilted his head back and let out a short breath, almost a laugh. He said, "Quiet. Halvor Doerr tried to talk me into drilling for an Artesian lens on my own ranch up in Eddy County in '74. Told me it was sitting right under my south fence. I told him a government man didn't know my land better than I did. I never drilled. I sold that ranch in '81 for less than I paid for it." And then Walt Pemberton, 64 years old, 38 years in the business, stuck out his weathered hand to a 14-year-old boy in a faded work coat with a frayed cuff, standing in the dust of the Crosby auction tent in Chaves County, New Mexico, and he shook his hand. And that was the moment. That was the whole turning point right there in that handshake. Because a handshake from Walt Pemberton in that part of the state, to anyone, meant something. It was an acknowledgement from a veteran to a boy who had just told him something true about his own country that he had not known. But that's not what this story is really about. Because Cal still had to get a well drilled. He still had to confirm the report was right, and he still had to answer the question that every one of those men in that tent, Walt included, was asking themselves as they walked back to their trucks that morning, which was, all right, the boy can read a report, but will the water actually be there? An Artesian aquifer is a confined body of groundwater held under pressure by an impermeable layer above it. When a well is drilled into one, the natural pressure forces water to rise on its own, sometimes above the surface, without any need for pumping. The Roswell Artesian Basin in southeastern New Mexico was one of the most studied Artesian systems in the United States during the 20th century. But by the 1980s, most of the original mapping had been forgotten by everyone except a few aging soil scientists and the documents they had left behind. The following Tuesday, Cal Doerr drove out to Bell Brothers Drilling on the south side of Artesia. He sat across a metal desk from Roy Bell, who was 61 years old and had been drilling water wells in southeastern New Mexico since 1948. Cal laid out the USGS report, the soil survey, his grandfather's old hydrology notebook with 3 pages of cross-referenced calculations, and the deed to Parcel 7. Roy Bell read it all in silence for about 20 minutes. Then he looked up at the boy and he said, "Son, I knew Halvor Doerr." Cal said, "Yes, sir. He's the one taught me how to read these." And Roy said, "When do you want me to drill?" They started on a Thursday in late November. Roy Bell brought a rotary rig out across the cracked mud of the dry pond and set up about 40 yards from the collapsed well house. He drilled all of Thursday. He drilled most of Friday. At 260 feet on Friday afternoon, the soil composition changed from sandy clay to dense blue-gray clay, just exactly the way the report said it would. Cal stood beside the rig in his coat, breath white in the cold air, holding his grandfather's brass instrument in its felt case in his pocket. At 281 feet, on the Friday before Thanksgiving in 1986, the drill bit broke through the clay layer. Water came up under its own pressure. It came up clear, cold, and steady, 12 gallons a minute pushing on its own. No pump. Roy Bell stood next to the boy in the cold November sun and watched the water come up out of the dry New Mexico desert. And he didn't say anything for a long time. Then he said, "Your grandfather would have liked to see that, son." And Cal said, "Yes, sir, he would have." Now here's how these things travel. The story got around the way these stories get around in the high desert. Slow at first and then everywhere at once. It got told over coffee at the truck stop in Artesia. It got told on the pews at the First Presbyterian Church in Roswell on Sunday morning. Quiet, between the hymns. It got told over fences and at the feed store and at the diner where the morning ranchers ate their breakfasts. You hear about the Doerr boy? Halvor's grandson bought that dust parcel at the Crosby auction. Hit Artesian water at 280 feet. In March of 1987, Cal sold the surface water rights to that well to the Pecos Valley Stockmen's Cooperative for $48,000 and a lifetime royalty on every gallon they drew from it. He kept the land. By the summer of 1988, he had his own small herd grazing on grass that had come back the moment the water did. By 1990, he had drilled a second well on a different section he had bought with the proceeds, and he had hit water again. By 1995, at the age of 23, he had hung a small wooden sign at the end of the gravel road that led up to the small office he had built on Parcel 7. The sign said 3 words, Doerr Hydrology Consulting. That was it. No phone number. Everybody who needed the number already had it. He did not go to college. That was not the road. The work came to him the way the work had come to his grandfather, by word of mouth, across coffee cups and fence lines and church pews, across 3 counties, and then across 5, and eventually across the entire southeast quarter of the state. Now, let me tell you about one more day. It was the spring of 2003. Walt Pemberton was 81 years old by then, and he was finally retiring from the auction circuit. He had sold his business in Artesia to a younger man, and he was making the rounds, stopping in to see the people he had done business with over more than 50 years in the trade. And one afternoon in late April, he drove his old red pickup out the gravel road south of Roswell, past the working windmill that Cal had rebuilt in '88, past the green pastures that ran clear out to the fence line, past the small herd of black Angus grazing along the bank of the pond that was no longer dry, and he pulled up in front of the small office at the end of the road. Cal came out, 30 years old now, lean, sun-lined the way his grandfather had been, the same kind of weathered work coat. Walt got out of the truck slow, with both hands on the door. They stood there in the New Mexico sun for a while and they talked about the old auctions, about the men who were gone now, about Halvor. And at the end of the visit, Walt stuck out his hand one more time, their third handshake. He held on to the younger man's hand a second longer than he needed to, and he looked at him and he said, "Cal, I need to tell you something. That day at the Crosby auction, when you bought Parcel 7, I almost didn't shake your hand. I listened to what you said about the Artesian lens and the report and the depth, and I almost walked away because I figured you just heard it somewhere and were repeating it. I wasn't sure you really knew what you were talking about. I shook your hand because of your grandfather, mostly, because of Halvor, not because of you, and I have felt poorly about that for 17 years. Cal thought about that for a moment, and he said, "Walt, I got lucky my grandfather kept the reports." And Walt Pemberton shook his head, slow, and he said, "No, Cal, you got lucky you read them." And that was the last time they saw each other. Walt passed in the winter of 2004. Cal drove up to Artesia for the funeral and sat in the back of the small white church and didn't say much to anybody. Doerr Hydrology Consulting is still there, on the gravel road south of Roswell. The archive fills 2 full filing cabinets now, and there is talk of needing a third. Every report Halvor Doerr ever saved is in there, and every one Cal has added to the collection over 40 years is in there too. And in the middle of the main office, on a shelf above Cal's desk, right where the late afternoon light from the west window falls across it on a clear day, sits a small brass hydrology instrument in a worn felt case. It was made in 1951. The brass has gone dark where 2 generations of hands have held it. The leather strap is original, taped to the felt case under a strip of clear tape that has gone a little brittle at the edges. There is a small square of paper, yellowed now. 2 words in careful handwriting. Read them. The Roswell Artesian Basin lost more than half its measurable pressure between 1950 and the year 2000. The wells that survived the drawdown, almost without exception, were the ones drilled into confined lenses below the main aquifer. The information needed to find them existed for decades in publicly available federal documents. Most landowners in the basin never opened those documents. The few who did, like Halvor Doerr and his grandson after him, built quiet lives on a kind of knowledge that did not require a degree or a license, only the patience to read what most people walked past.